While us Leviah players wait till dusk till dawn, even our most devout members have strayed towards other heroes. Among us is Day 1 League of Leviah member Pentragarth, who not only swapped to Uzuri, but also started an assassin-centric channel called The Plague Hive. He joins us today to walk through his Road to Nationals winning Uzuri list, where he faced Briar, Lexi, Viscerai, Lexi, Dory again, Dromai, and Dash to take down an entire Road to Nationals. Up yours, Uzuri players. Not that is not serious. Please don't take offense to that. I just couldn't think of another you intro, but this video is really all about Uzuris because we have a specialist with us today. This is Bruno from the channel Plague Hive, which hopefully you all have seen across YouTube now because it's got some amazing assassin-based content. So Bruno, you've been doing a great job. Where are you actually based out of when it comes for Flesh and Blood?
Germany, actually, and that's the extent of where I haven't traveled anywhere. I haven't been to the States or anything for it so far. But I just kind of recently decided to take the game a little bit more seriously. So I went to ProQuest, the last one that went up with Leviah, actually. Didn't work out so hot, to be honest. So for the Road to Nationals, I decided, okay, I need something else, I need to switch to a different hero if I want to be serious about actually competing in this game. So I figured, okay, Uzuri sounds right up my alley, right? Because there's actually a couple of parallels to Brute for how she plays, in a way. And I decided I wanted to play a class that is not about raw damage, so no aggro hero or anything. I wanted something that has disruption, that forces the enemy to interact, basically. So Assassin is what I landed on, basically. And I managed to actually win the whole thing, to my surprise, actually. I didn't think that would happen. I was aiming for top 8, just get that cold foil. But yeah, actually got first place.
Well done. You really went from a class that has pretty much no on hits to a class that is all about interaction. But one thing that you've really done to make yourself unique beyond just be a now accomplished Uzuri player, you kickstarted this assassin-based YouTube channel called Plague Hive. What is kind of your vision behind starting that?
The idea was from the start, because I don't really consider myself to be a super crazy good player or anything, right? So my idea from the beginning was basically, okay, let's get some of the really good Uzuri players, assassin players worldwide, and basically provide a platform, right, for them to share sort of their ideas, their deck building, their brews and stuff like that. And just get them on the channel, get that stuff out there for people who want to, get started on the class and get into the class and check out how they work. Because like I said, there's not a ton of content like that out there. So I figured, okay, I might as well just provide a platform for that. So that's what I've been kind of doing, a couple of deck tech videos and like matchups and stuff. It's pretty bare bones so far. There's not a ton of videos out, but I'm aiming to change that.
Yeah, it's okay.
I'm taking it slow at the moment.
You got to start from somewhere, right? And truly, like you said, the only assassin videos I really remember coming across were like the 2-hour deep dives from Tao Tao, which those were enjoyable, but there wasn't much beyond that. So great job finding that niche and jumping right in. But speaking of, let's actually take a look at the deck that you won your RTN with, so we can teach a couple of aspiring Uzuri players what to do. Okay, cool. So Bruno, we are taking a look at your deck that you won the RTN with. And first up, there's that choice with Uzuri to either take more of a redline or a control build. And Uzuri is still in a place where not everyone has kind of like decided what the best list for Uzuri looks like. So what really went into like picking this version of the list? I think it's a redline, right? We haven't really gone into it.
Yeah. This is like, if you look at the counts, there's like 5 blues and 10 yellows in the entire list, and everything else is red. So this is definitely a redline list. Really kind of the name redline, right? This is based off of the list that Ben Dodd originally came up with. And you might know that from Sam Dando. He played it at the Chicago Brawl. And then recently Colin Swisher played a very similar list at the Calling in Baltimore and got like 10th place with it. So I think this is like the version of it that has had the most competitive success, I would say, the redline list. But really what differentiates the two kind of archetypes of Uzuri at the moment is really a focus around stealth cards, or a focus around contract cards, right? And that's like what you refer to as the like slightly more control list, I say, is like the contract list, right? And my reasoning behind running a Redline list into this event is I believe it has a slightly better matchup spread into the very defensive decks, right? So like Dash, Oldhim, Dromai, mainly Dromai, which was like a consideration of mine because I figured there would be a couple of Dromai players. And then the contract list on the flip side has a slightly better matchup into the aggressive list. So stuff like Runeblade, Ranger, Ninja, you know, that kind of stuff. But the Redline list does pretty well into Rangers and stuff as well. So, and they're not hugely different. We're talking like maybe 5 to 10% either way, right? So it's not like the lists are hugely different in their matchup spreads. But my idea was I was, you know, expecting a pool of mostly Ranger with some Dromai mixed in there. So I figured, okay, I'm going to take a Redline list to make my chances into those like defensive grindy matchups that Uzuri traditionally has problems with a little better. And that actually worked out pretty well for me because like the semifinals I had to play against the Dromai, and then the finals were against the Dash on a pretty heavy control pistol plan.
Well, look, that's already impressive. You're saying you beat that Dromai then.
Yeah, I did.
Because I was gonna poke you a bit, make you admit what are like the two best and worst matchups for this deck?
The worst are probably, I mean, for this specific list in this specific iteration, by far the worst is Kano. Sure. Kano is just if you're taking this list and you're sitting down across a Kano, you can basically just pick up your stuff. This list is running AB1, 5 blues, and no Oasis Respite. Like if you win against a Kano that's once in a blue moon, doesn't happen. Hasn't happened in my testing, but that was a conscious decision on my part. I decided to just sacrifice the Kano matchup entirely because I figured it wouldn't be a very popular choice. There were actually 2 Kanos at my event, but I managed to dodge them. And not a single Icelander. So the Wizard matchup is just something where I was like, okay, you know, if it happens, that's fine. I'll take my loss. I need to sideboard space for other stuff. Apart from that, the worst matchups are probably Dash and Oldhim. Or Dash and Dromai, and then Oldhim is like not great, but doable, I would say. But Dash and Dromai definitely the worst ones because they just create this continuous board advantage, and Assassin has a hard time dealing with that. Best matchups, I would say probably Ranger, definitely. Like this is one of the few decks I think in the current meta where you can be like, hey, I'm happy to see Alexi.
Right.
And I think that's, you know, you play Brute, you play Reiner, so you know that's not something that a lot of decks can currently say where they're definitely like, hey, I'm happy if my opponent is playing Lexi. So that's probably one of the reasons why I chose to pick her.
No, that's really great. So you can help humble those Rangers who think they're just picking up like an unbeatable deck, walking into an RTN, and then they face an Uzuri, and like that's what you want. You want to prey on those players.
I want, absolutely. Like it's not an auto win by any means, but it's a pretty good matchup,
That's awesome. Cool. So let's actually take a walk through this deck list, just so that anyone who wants to pick up Uzuri and play a tested list at this point, a list that's won an RTN. Let's walk through and just justify some decisions here on what you picked. So we've got kind of the split. I assume this is like your main package of equipment that you're taking into most matchups. Sure, walk us through the core.
Yeah, okay. So let's start from the top, you know, just Black Techs, Black Tech Whispers. In this specific list, it's basically just Snapdragons with an upside. It blocks 1, which can be pretty relevant. And then maybe you get to recycle it like once every 3 games or so. So this deck doesn't generate a ton of silver, basically. Like you have 5 contracts in the list that can actually make silver, and then they need to hit in order to make silver. So don't expect to be able to buy this multiple times per game, right? Like if you want that, play a contract list that can play around this whole silver generation, item recycling aspect of Assassin a lot more. In this case, this is basically just Snapdragons with a slight upside, essentially. So if you're trying to build this on a budget, just sub out the Black Techs, run Snapdragons, you're going to be mostly fine. Crown of Providence. So the only other option you have in the head slot basically would be the Mask of Perdition, which again, this is not a contract list, so Mask of Perdition doesn't make any sense. And then Crown of Providence is just 2 block, able to cycle out your arsenal. And there's a bunch of cards in this deck that you don't really want to see in Arsenal. So if you have your Crown still up, that frees you up, right? Like sometimes you get these situations where the opponent overblocks one of your stealth cards, and then you can't swap something in and you have to Arsenal it. And then if you have Crown up, that just kind of takes some pressure out, right? Because you're never going to be stuck with a bad Arsenal as long as you still have Crown of Providence up. Flick Knives, amazing card. This is basically like Goliath Gauntlet and Iron Rod Gauntlet rolled into one item.
It's a good way to put it. Yeah.
That's really like the best way to put it. And these were the 2 spots that were run in Arachne before Outsiders, basically. You were running either Iron Rod just for the 1 block, or you were running Goliath just to punch up something, right? Flick Knives just has tons of utility. You can use it to make your attacks connect, because you can do the Flick Knife Nerve Scalpel trick, where you flick Nerve Scalpel in response to the opponent playing a defense reaction. And then because the defense reaction only becomes defending, once it resolves, it'll be reduced by the on-hit from Nerve Scalpel, right? So if you send, let's say, a Shakedown, right? The opponent blocks with Armor Piece for 2, and then they want to play a Sink Below. You can flick the Nerve Scalpel, and now that Sink only defends for 3. So you go 1 over, and the on-hit effect hits. You can use it to pop Sand Cover, which came up actually in the match against Dromite 2 times. So that's pretty relevant. You can actually use it to kill someone when they're on like 1 health, simply because it's almost unavoidable damage unless they run damage prevention. So this card just has a ton of utility and a ton of different uses that you can get out of it.
Yeah, absolutely really fantastic card. And at the Q&A panel at Pro Tour, Brian Gottlieb was called out by James White. Apparently this card was incredibly hard to balance. And I think the current iteration is pretty nifty. You rarely see it used to preemptively throw a debuff that's not Nerve Scalpel, right? But just like you mentioned, it is still flexible beyond the Nerve Scalpel use case specifically. It's a really, really great card. And then we've got Tunic and your daggers.
Yeah, Tunic is Tunic. I don't think I need to talk about Tunic. And then Nerve Scalpel and Spider's Bite is like my default loadout that I run into most matchups. I have 1 other dagger in the sideboard.
We can take a look
that's the Scale Peeler. And that is basically for Oldhim. You can also run it into Dorinthia. That's pretty good. Because Warrior just has this massive fridge of armor, and they're not running attack actions, so Spider's Bite is kind of dead. Some people also run it into Fi, simply because Fi is most likely not running defense reactions and most likely not wanting to block with cards from hand. So by using Scale Peeler, you can kind of control when they use their equipment, and you can make sure they use it on a turn where it doesn't matter as much to you as it would on another turn. So you can kind of play around with that. But realistically, this list is not looking to dagger every turn. You don't have the resources for that. Again, I'm running like 5 blues, 10 yellows maximum, and part of some of those yellows are in the sideboard. So I'm not looking to dagger every turn. It's more like when the opportunity presents itself, you have a hand where you have the resources for it, you can do it. But you're not definitely doing it every turn.
Makes a lot of sense. Now, you're omitting Orbitoclast from your list. Is that something you just don't think is worth it, or just don't have the slot?
No space for it, honestly. And the matchups where it would be relevant are kind of rare. So that's like basically Dorinthia, of which there was, I think, 1 or 2 at my road to Nationals. Then Dromai, where I'm like, okay, I kind of like it when she blocks with the dragons, because that means I don't have to clear the dragons. So by not using Orbitoclast, basically I'm kind of like pushing her a little more in the direction of wanting to block with the dragons to stop my stuff. And then finally the wizards, which I have already sacrificed. So Orbitoclast just wouldn't make any sense.
Sure. Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. But now we've got the main board to dig through, and you already mentioned how low the blue count is. So let's just try to kind of breeze through left to right on the card choices and why they're really in here. First up, we got the CNCs and the Death Touches, which I think make a lot of sense just from the get-go as very, very high-value swap targets.
Absolutely. Like I would say actually Death Touch is probably the in my opinion, second best card from Outsiders after Codex of Frailty. That card is just insanely pushed. Like, it's a 1/6 with an on hit that can be whatever you want. Like, so it can be a 1/8. It can be a 1/9 if you give like a Lexia Frailty token, right? That will typically take 3 or 4 damage out of her turn. So it can even be a 1/10. If you give the opponent an inertia, it stops them from arsenaling a critical card. It's a 1/9. This card is just insanely above rate. And the restriction of only playing it from Arsenal is basically irrelevant for Uzuri in a stealth build, because you can just swap it in. It's just Death Touch. It's crazy good.
Yeah, and then of course there's still the synergy pieces where because you're a Tunic based list, a lot of lines would come up with your own codex. With if it is parked in Arsenal, the value of this card is insane. I'm jealous because as a brute player, we get some 6s. Pretty much none of them are this good.
Nope.
Oh well.
You can park it in Arsenal, block with your entire hand. If you have Tunic up, you still return 6 off of no cards in your hand. That's crazy.
Insane.
And you have Tunic up a lot in this build, actually, because you don't really pitch. You don't really need resources for your turn. So you will frequently sit on your Tunic counter for quite a while, which might seem inefficient at first. But it also means that you have the Tunic counter ready for those critical turns where you really need it. So there's like, it's, two sides basically to it. Like, you can look at it as, I'm not utilizing Tunic to its fullest effect, but also whenever I need that Tunic counter, I really need it. And then I usually have it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Then we've got E-Strike. Now, this is one that it's flexible in Redline lists just because you can use anything to go ahead and pay the cost. What's the mode that you're picking the most with the card? With this card?
I would say mostly the Go Again. It's typically a card that I utilize when I'm left with a big hand, which can happen in Uzuri. And that's like its main goal of being in a deck is having a way to utilize those kind of turns where your opponent doesn't really do anything after you disrupted them, right? So they're just sending maybe like a small hand at you or something. You can just tank it and then return more with the E-Strike. But you will also have turns where you're like, you already have an arsenal, you have 2 cards left, you're just sending E-Strike for 7, or you have no arsenal, you send E-Strike for 5, draw a card. It's really the flexibility and the fact that it blocks 3. That's why it's in the list.
Right.
Like, no specific mode stands out, I would say.
Makes a lot of sense. Then we've got a lot of your swap targets coming in. And like you mentioned, stealth is the keyword that really enables this kind of redline list to work, because Uzuri's ability is letting you swap in. It's a lot of text, right? But basically you're going to be able to put the stealth card at the bottom of your deck to swap in a 2 or less cost attack from your hand onto the attacking chain. So you've got Infect. Infect itself has a relevant on-hand effect in Bloodrot Pox. I like this one a lot because you can bait with it. If your opponent actually just says no blocks, then you play it as 0 for 5, right? Which is really strong. But as swap targets go, Isolate is kind of the nutso one because of the built-in Dominate effect. Which is your favorite? You've actually got 9 Isolate, so it's probably
Isolate.
Infect's
Isolate
pretty good too. I don't know.
I mean, honestly, they're all decent, but Isolate is by far the best one. Simply because, just think about it. It basically, if you think about Isolate, you can think about Isolate as a gem that says, when you pitch this, the attack that you pitch it for gains Dominate, and then it also blocks 3.
Whoa.
And you can have 9 of those in the deck.
Wow.
And your opponent doesn't see what attack it is until after they blocked.
I love
Isolate
that framing.
is nuts.
That is a great
Isolate
way to think about it,
is completely nuts. Like, seriously, this card is so good. If I could run more than 9 Isolates, I would. You're limited to 9, so that's how many you play. Some of the contract lists run only 6 of them, simply because they're really not trying to play around the stealth swap thing so much. But for a redline list, you don't go below 9 Isolates. Like, there's no reason to. This card is just really kind of like the bread and butter engine of what the deck does.
Makes a lot of sense.
And then the rest of the stealth cards are just basically the most impactful ones you can run, because you cannot run more than 9 Isolates, right? So you have the 3 ones that give a token. So you have Infect, Sedate, and Wither. here, and then Wither is a little further down the line. And then that's pretty much it. You don't run any of the others.
What's your thought then on Infiltrate? Because that's one that I don't see experimented with pretty much at all.
Yeah.
It's kind of an awkward effect, right?
Exactly. The problem with Infiltrate is mostly that you have no guarantee to actually hit anything that you could use. So there's a couple of decks where it's pretty reliable, right? Like if you play it against a ninja, for example, the chances of you hitting something that's just like a 0 for 3 go again is pretty high, and you can utilize that. But if you play against a guardian, for example, and they let it hit for whatever reason, and then you hit like a Macho Grande in a list with 5 blues, you have no way to play that, right? Plus, it only hits for 3. So the opponent can block it with a single card, so the effect is not really that relevant. And if you switch it out, it doesn't do anything. So it's just, at the end of the day, the effect is not reliable enough to make it worth running it over something like Infect, which is just a 0 for 5 if it hits.
At least it's cool art, though, right? It's got that.
It is, absolutely. Like, I love the card. I wish it was more reliable in running. Or that I would have the sideboard space to bring it in for matchups where I can actually do something with the cards I get. But, 80 cards.
It's all right, because speaking of cool art, we have Leave No Witnesses. One of the cards that just terrifies me the most as someone who plays Leviathan loves their arsenal. Yep. Leave No Witnesses has just become leaps and bounds better with Codex of Frailty, being able to cycle it back in. Even swapping this on from an Isolate is terrifying in its own right. It's a great card, right? Like, just a great card, 0 for 4, even if it's played alone. Is this kind of the main reason that Nimblism makes its way into a list, is just enabling like the Nimblism, Codex, Leave No Witnesses lines? Is that kind of the gist of it?
Yeah, to some extent. Like, you can also just do Nimblism, Leave No Witnesses for a 2-card hand, which is pretty terrifying, right? You can also, and this is something you can do. You can see that in some of the other cards that are coming. I'm running Razor's Edge and Spike with Bloodrot. So what you can also do is Nimblism, Isolate, and then a reaction or 2. Basically build your own Macho Grande, where you just come in for like 9 Dominate or something with an on-hit effect, which is pretty filthy. So Nimblism seems a little counterintuitive at first. If you look at, because the buff doesn't stay if you swap, right? Like if you play a Nimblism on an Isolate and then you swap it in, you just wasted the Nimblism. But think about the following 2-card hand. You have Tunic up, Nimblism, Codex of Frailty. You bring back a Death Touch, and then you have a Death Touch for 9.
Yeah, disgusting.
It's pretty good.
It's so flexible, and that Nimblism was like the breakout card back when Sam Dando did really well at the Brawl. Nimblism was kind of like the card that I feel everyone just went, I get it.
Yep.
Because it's all the way back, just a generic from Welcome to Wraith. But the ability to, like you said, build your own, just very detrimental on hit effects, just make them taller is a big deal. So it's 3 Nimblism, but there are quasi effects you could work in, like Premeditate, right, or Scout. Do you just don't think those are really worth it?
I was thinking about it, but at the end of the day, the main problem is all of them are less flexible than Nimblism. Right? So for example, let's take Premeditate, right? Where you'd be like, okay, Ponder is obviously very good because it just draws a card, right? The main problem is the majority of cards you play from Arsenal are either stealth cards that you're looking to swap, in which case Premeditate does nothing. I guess technically you actually keep the Ponder, but you're wasting the damage, right? Because Premeditate just says the next time an attack hits. So that would actually carry over to the swap, but you would waste the 3 damage off it. So it's kind of not so great. Or it's on a Codex turn, in which case double Ponder is significantly worse than single Ponder. So I just chose to run Nimblism simply because you can convert it with a card in hand. It's just more flexible at the end of the day. I was thinking about Come to Fight for a while, simply because it blocks 3. And you can also use it like Come to Fight into CNC, for 9, which is pretty filthy. But 1 costs is a huge downside for a deck that doesn't want to pitch in the first place. So for now, I'm sticking with Nimblism. It's just the most flexible of the bunch.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Speaking of zero cost, the other kind of half of the generic aggro pool, Ravenous Rabble. Of course, when an all red deck is, I mean, hey, built at all reds, this thing is pretty much a 0 for 4 most of the time. Just makes sense. You spoke a little bit on the pumps that you're bringing in, Spike with Blood Rot and Razor's Edge. That's just strictly, they're flexible damage cards, right? They're just going to.
It's just branching, basically, right? Like if your opponent, for example, let's say you play an Infect, right? And your opponent blocks 6. Now, if you would have a swap in hand, you can't really do anything. But if you have an Razor's Edge and a Spike with Blood Rot and Tunic up, suddenly you can push over that 6. You're coming in for 9, and now you're giving them 2 Blood Rot tokens.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So basically, you're swinging in for 13 damage, essentially, off of 3 cards and a Tunic counter, which is pretty nuts. And the opponent blocked 6.
Wow.
So, yeah. This deck has some pretty filthy lines. And then you can do stuff like pump up an isolate late game, right? If you pitch stack the Razor's Edges, for example, to get around an Oldhim, when they've used up all of their defense reactions, you can just come in for 9 or even 12 with Dominate in the late game if you stack it correctly. You just have that added flexibility of not always needing to swap, but you can also buff the attack straight up and just come in that way.
Yeah, that's the Dorinthia level mind games that Uzuri can really bring to the table. It's never as linear as this is just going to swap into a CNC or a Shakedown. That's not just what you play around. So it's really cool. Exactly, when you add the multiple play sets of pumps like this, it adds just that much more for your opponent to consider. Now, moving forward here, you only run the 5 blues, like you mentioned. 3 of them are Isolate, 2 of them are Surgical. So obviously you're valuing the Isolate a little bit higher. Surgical, though, why not actually just go to 6 and kind of fully pad out a blue that is flexible to swap in as well? Are you really just that afraid of the Ravenous hit or what?
I mean, to some extent, like every blue in your deck makes Ravenous worse. That's one consideration. Also, Surgical is typically not a very good swap in the first cycle. Because it's pretty easy to block out with like a single card, you know? You can just go like, I mean, sure, if you defense react it, right, I can flick, and that can be pretty good if it turns up, but you just usually prefer to swap in something else. So Surgical is more like a late game card. In second cycle, you pitch it in the first cycle, and all of your isolates end up on the bottom anyways, right? Because you know they go to the bottom when you activate Uzuri's ability. So Surgical is kind of like that late game second cycle threat that you still have in your deck. You can sometimes play it out in the first cycle, and it can be pretty impactful, especially against decks like Lexi that really don't want to block. And then you just get to choose which card you strip from their hand. But at the end of the day, even though it's probably the strongest on-hit Assassin has access to, it's kind of the hardest one to actually convert. Because it's also a card that is really not good to just straight up play out. It costs 2, it only attacks for 4, so it's pretty easy to block out. And you're not running any pumps that could get it over that, like unlike a contract list, right? Where you would run stuff like Cut to the Chase. The only thing we have here is Shred, in theory, if we're bringing it in a matchup. So it's just, at the end of the day, it's kind of like the least impactful swap that you could bring in a way.
No, that makes sense, right? Because if you're trying to build this list to just land disruption versus like a ranger or something, I mean, if you can just play a Shakedown, that's going to land. They're not going to block, right? You're just going to deal 6 and get a very similar effect to Surgical. So you still need to make sure you're presenting enough damage alongside disruption to not kind of lose your grip on the game. So
exactly.
Yeah, so like prioritizing slots for more damage makes more sense because you can do that. You can disrupt a lot with your reds anyway, right? As we already saw with the other swap targets. CNC, absolutely. Death Touch, Shakedown. Okay. Moving on into your sideboard, though, this is where things get a bit more flexible. You've got Down and Dirty, which to me just reads Pauper from Arsenal, right? That's all it's doing.
Pretty much. It's like some people run it for the Ranger matchups as well, because when the opponent, or in the mirror too, any deck that runs Codex of Frailty, right? Like you can bring back a Down and Dirty and then still block with it. And that can cleanly block a lot of arrows, right? So if, like, for example, Alexi is loading an infecting shot with her Codex of Frailty, you have to discard a card, you bring back Down and Dirty, you can block with that, and a card from hand to clean block it, right? Like block the 5, and then she doesn't get to hit with that infecting shot. I personally didn't bring it versus the Rangers. I really only brought it in versus Dromai, and I guess technically Oldhim, but I didn't face one because you're just running the full pile versus Oldhim anyways. It's just 70 cards, bring everything. Wow. But at the end of the day, it's really just Popper from Arsenal. That's pretty much what it is. But it does is really good. In that specific matchup, it is extremely good because you're basically not playing with an intellect penalty, right? Mm-hmm. If you're holding a Popper, you're basically playing with an IP penalty because you're not utilizing that one card. If you put down a dirty in your arsenal, you can just play your 4-card hand every turn, do stuff, clear dragons, pressure the Dromai, and you still have that guaranteed Popper sitting in arsenal exactly for when you need it.
Mm-hmm. That's huge. But speaking of Arsenal play, you've got another defense reaction you're bringing in. This one, I don't know if it's just me not being familiar with the Uzuri list. Frailty Trap. Interesting. I would assume this is like a extra tech against Lexi, right?
Yes,
because
Lexi
all errors have go again. Frailty then gets, probably 2 to 3 value. So this becomes like a block 5 at times. That's pretty good.
Yep. It can be kind of block 6 sometimes. It's really good against dash, right? Pistol dash for the same reason, basically, because you just take like 3 or 4 damage out of her entire turn sometimes. Mm. And you can do some neat tricks with it. So if Alexi, for example, loads a Bolton shot and gives it +1, and you have a Frailty Trap, her turn is just dead unless they commit Snapdragons in that scenario. Because you strip the go again from it with the Frailty token. And then unless they have a Rain Razors or they commit Snapdragons, that's just their turn. They can't do anything else.
That's incredible.
So that's why I'm on 3. It's mostly a Lexi tech, and it has been extremely good against Lexi. But I'm also 100% sure I would not have won my final match versus Dash without this card. So Frailty Trap, good card.
And for all the Boltons out there, because there's tons of them, right? I'm sure this card helps the combo Bolton a lot.
This card would wreck Bolton, yes. If he would be played, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. So you've got another swap target in Humble.
Speaking of cards that would wreck Bolton if he was being played, yes. Sure. Humble is surprisingly relevant. I think this card is a little underrated currently, but it's good into almost anything that's relevant in the meta currently. Again, with Lexi, if you can catch her in the correct situation, you can cripple her turn with it. If she ends with just a single card face down in Arsenal, and you land a Humble, she can't flip it up. So she cannot use New Horizons, which means her turn is going to be significantly worse. Mm-hmm. You can land it against the Dromai. If they have a bunch of dragons out, they can attack with a single one of them, which basically cripples their turn. It's just an extra disruptive card that's good against a surprising amount of matchups. So yeah,
interesting that you say that you'd play it aggressively against the Dromai. In my head, I see 6. I think Popper, but that's actually quite smart. If they do develop that board, the Humble buys you a turn as well as presenting 6, and you're probably working it in with some kind of Uzuri stealth swap, so you can hopefully make it pretty inefficient turn for them. That's really interesting. But speaking of Dromai, I assume you've got Hurl in here. Hurl was something I was adding into my assassin list to help a little bit in the dragon clear game plan. Is that what you're using it for, or where's it
mostly what it's for? It's just the head jab at the end of the day. Sometimes the effect can be relevant, but it's mostly for clearing dragons and for pushing some extra damage in the more defensive matchups like Dash or Oldhim, where you can reliably keep larger hands simply because they don't really do much on their turn. Azalea 2 or Bravo, when they dominate, you can bring this card in simply because you can only block with a single card. And then having a way to actually utilize that hand you've kept by necessity, essentially, can also be pretty relevant. So that's usually where I bring those in. But they're not for the aggro matchups. You're not trying to race an aggro deck. That doesn't work. So
against aggro, then, you're probably bringing in you've actually got it in the link. It'll be in the description. You've got some of your sideboard broken up on February. Thank you for that. That's against aggro. Then, are you taking mostly in a little bit more defensive tools so that you can max your hands better, the sinks and the frailties, and then against
sinks
aggro,
and the frailty traps?
Yeah, it kind of splinters more this way. That makes a lot of sense.
Yep. Basically, it's split more or less two ways, right? Like you have the defensive cards on the one side, and then you have the shreds on the other side, and then stuff like Humble and Hurl that come in like a little bit depending for specific heroes. But generally, against aggressive decks, you're running the defensive cards. Against defensive decks, you're running the shreds to get through their blocks, and then the rest is sort of like matchup specific.
Makes a lot of sense. Now, the last two cards here, you already kind of mentioned you run the pile against Oldhim, so Plague Hive gets good value. You're going to see your deck multiple times. Remembrance, shuffling in, really high priority cards. Do these have any other flexibility, and what do you normally do to Remembrance?
Remembrance is also good against Dromai because you can just, you have a single copy of Remembrance, basically means you have 3 more poppers in your deck. That can be pretty relevant. It can clunk you up a little bit if you draw it at an inopportune time, but I found it's worth it just to have 3 more poppers, basically. And then Plague Hive, I run into every matchup where either every single of the tokens is relevant, or I can expect it to see it multiple times, which is basically almost every matchup currently, except for Dromai, I think, simply because, every other matchup, you're happy to see every token, or you can be like, hey, I can see this like 2 or even 3 times per game, and then it's just free value, basically.
Makes sense.
It's a good card.
I still need to
also like my channel is named after it, so you know.
Yeah, there you go. it's the Plague Hive tax, but at least it's a beautiful card, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the last slots, we mentioned a bit about your AB already, Scale Peeler. Now, in the intro, you said black techs were kind of the expensive option. If you really wanted to go budget, run snaps anytime. I didn't notice you actually also ran snaps. So what is the difference in decision-making there? Why do you take one or the other?
So snaps is for matchups where you cannot reliably expect black techs to connect, right? Because black techs needs you to hit, and it needs you to hit a hero. That's one of the main problems that Assassin has, and why Assassin has such a hard matchup into Dromai. Everything you do needs to hit a hero for it to actually do anything. So Snapdragons is basically for your Oldhim, for your Dash, for your Dromai matchup, basically, where you cannot reliably expect the black text to actually connect. And then sometimes you just need that crucial pivot turn where you can have go again, right? So you can do turns like you have Tunic up, for example, and you have, like, let's say your hand is Isolate, Death Touch, Codex of Frailty, something like that. You can do Isolate, Death Touch, then pop the snaps, right? Because the opponent is running D-React, so they're getting around it, basically. And then you play the Codex, you get the Death Touch back, you can play that with the Tunic counter. So those are kind of the lines you're trying to make here. You could try to make this as impactful as possible to pivot and turn the game around. Or sometimes against Dromai, you're just using it to clear an extra dragon.
If you're doing that, bless you. I hope you win that game, but it doesn't sound like you will be. But then you've
honestly, that's how I did it in my game versus Dromai at the Road to Nationals. I was forced to use snaps to clear a Miragai in like turn 3 or 4 or something. Simply because I had no other expedient way of actually getting it off the board, and I cannot let it stand around. And you kind of have to do both. You have to clear dragons and pressure the Dromai. You cannot just clear dragons. There's lists that can do that, but this list is not one of them. You need to do both. And then sometimes Snapdragons is the only way you can reliably achieve that. So that's just what you have to do.
Okay,
it's not a good matchup.
I'll eat my words. I take it back. One thing that I do truly doubt, though, and you're still running it, the Vambrace plus Scale Peeler as a way to combat Oldhim, who takes like Rampart Crown. Is that really what you find Oldhims do anymore? I swear they just take Sledge. Yeah.
They basically just take Sledge. So we actually have like this huge ongoing discussion over in the Uzuri channel on the FabTCG Discord, whether or not you should still run Scale Peeler, right? So my line of reasoning for still having it in the deck is that I might face an Oldhim who doesn't know that they should run Sledge into the matchup. It might happen. Honestly, like, I haven't played a single Oldhim at my Road to Nationals, so it wasn't actually relevant. But that was basically my line of reasoning. And then if you're going to a tournament which has like open deck lists at the top tables, and your opponent sees you don't have Scale Peeler in the list, so they're free to bring Rampart, and that suddenly makes your matchup a lot harder. But obviously that's not relevant for like Road to Nationals or anything. So realistically, you can probably cut the Scale Peeler, run something else in the slot. I just haven't figured out what to put in there yet. There's a bunch of options in there. So I chose to stick with this for now, just to hedge my bets against, old Hims that didn't know they should be on Sledge, basically.
I will say I really appreciate Vambrace for a different line that's not possible in your list at least, but with Sneak Attack. I believe it was Francisco Giorgio with his Uzuri deck tech at Pro Tour was running Sneak Attack really because of Vambrace in the Oldhim matchup, where you can just make it a 2-card 8, again and again. That sounds really good to me, but of course you'd have to change your pitch base to accommodate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Francesco's list runs some I'm not entirely sure, but 15 to 20 blues, something like this, because he's also the blues he runs kind of like are dual purpose, right? Because he runs a lot of the blue stealth cards that only have 1 power. And then he also runs Looking for a Scrap, where he can banish one of those cards from his graveyard to actually give it a go again. And that's kind of like the idea that he went with that list. For my taste, that list is way too many 2-blocks. Like the amount of 2-blocks I have in this list is already kind of scary sometimes for a deck that really likes blocking a lot. So that's kind of my reasoning there.
Well, okay, Bruno, it was awesome to have you. I really appreciate you going deep on the card choices here. It really helps when people see a list like this and then they try to say, oh, I don't like that card, I'm going to put this in and that in, and things start to fall apart a bit. So just being able to really justify why it's all in here helps a lot of people, because Uzuri is a very solid deck, like you already mentioned, into a Ranger-heavy field. So if that's what you're facing in your Road to Nationals in your local area, man, I'd be thinking about taking Uzuri too. I might even have it in my backpack headed to this doubleheader RTN this weekend.
I just want to take a second to give a huge shout out to Ben Dodd, Colin Swisher, and Ollie Cornell, who really helped me a ton with understanding how this hero operates and how her lines work, and actually making me able to do this and win this Road to Nationals. I wouldn't have been able to do this without them. So huge shout out to these 3 guys. They're amazingly insightful. I have a couple of videos where I feature them on my channel, and they go in a lot more depth into the deck and what the lists can do. So if you're interested in that, check that out, definitely.
Absolutely. There'll be a link below. Thank you so much, Bruno, for joining me. And everybody, we'll see you next time.
You're welcome. See ya.